Hello, friends. In today's video, we will dive into one of the most complex and controversial topics, slavery and its justification in the Bible. We will analyze key texts and their meanings in the context of antiquity, as well as try to understand how these ideas have influenced society both then and now. If you're interested in deep reflections on this topic, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new episodes. Let's explore together. Slavery was a widely practiced institution in ancient times, and biblical texts describe it as part of the social fabric of that period. The Old Testament and the New Testament, presenting the spiritual and moral foundations for the lives of the Israelites, include references that reflect the existence of slavery and even provide some regulations for its governance. For people of that time, slavery was an integral part of the economic and social structure, but biblical texts approached it from different angles, from laws and regulations to recommendations for humane treatment and moral reflections. Let us consider how these texts discuss and legitimize slavery, as well as explore how they have influenced subsequent interpretations and discussions. The Old Testament discusses slavery in the context of the economic and social needs of ancient Israel. Some key texts related to slavery can be found in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. These laws and regulations, despite acknowledging the existence of slavery, offer certain limitations and even protection for slaves, although from the perspective of modern ethical standards, they remain quite limited. In the book of Exodus, chapter 21, there are laws governing the relationships between masters and slaves. It specifies that a Hebrew slave must be freed after 6 years of service to a Hebrew master. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free. For nothing, this practice, known as the Year of Jubilee, provided limited freedom for slaves, but it applied only to Hebrews. The situation was different for foreign slaves, who could be held for life and even passed down as inheritance. Leviticus also mentions slaves, allowing the purchase of foreign slaves and treating them as property. And as for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from the nations that are around you, and they shall become your property. Most slaves in ancient times became slaves due to debt. The Old Testament mentions the practice of debt slavery. If a person could not repay a debt, they could offer themselves or their children as slaves. However, in the book of Deuteronomy, the importance of showing compassion to such individuals and the possibility of redemption is emphasized. Despite the status of slaves, many laws called for more humane treatment. For instance, Exodus states that if a master injures their slave seriously, the slave can be granted freedom. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money. In the New Testament, slavery is primarily viewed through the lens of spiritual obedience and humility. While the Old Testament provides detailed legislative guidelines, the New Testament offers instructions for both slaves and masters, calling for justice and respect. Though it does not advocate for the abolition of slavery, the Apostle Paul, whose letters often address issues of Christian behavior, appeals to slaves and masters for relative equality. For example, he writes, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ." In this instruction, Paul encourages slaves to fulfill their duties not out of fear of their masters, but as a devotion to God. He also exhorts masters to treat their slaves fairly and with respect, reminding them that before God they are equal. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. In his letter to Philemon, Paul appeals to the master to accept the runaway slave Onesimus not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. Although Paul does not call for the abolition of slavery, he emphasizes the value of spiritual equality. Biblical texts have had a significant impact on how slavery was later perceived. At different times, these texts were used to justify slavery, but they were also employed in its critique. Some early Christian theologians and subsequent thinkers believed that slavery was a natural part of society. At the same time, other movements and figures, such as abolitionists in America, turned to the same biblical texts to emphasize the dignity and equality of all people before God, calling for the liberation of slaves. Slavery in the Bible is a complex and multi-layered topic that includes both legal justifications and moral constraints. The biblical texts, created in an era when slavery was the norm, adapted rules to fit the existing society, reflecting its norms and needs. However, they also contain elements that highlight the value of the individual and lay the groundwork for the gradual abandonment of slavery. Modern analysis of slavery in the Bible not only helps to understand the ancient world but also reveals how sacred texts can adapt, becoming a foundation for the movement for rights and freedoms.